Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Nick Zolovich, part of the team at Cherokee Media Group and senior editor of Subprime Auto Finance News. In today's webinar, Reimagining Collaboration, Slack, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, and the post-COVID world of work. We have a great presentation in store brought to you by Payix, together with Visa, and featuring Phil Simon, an award-winning author, speaker, trainer, professor, and advisor. But before we get started, I want to go over just a couple quick housekeeping items for today's session. We are recording our webinar today, and we'll make that recording available to you as soon as possible. You'll be in listen-only mode for our session today, but we will reserve some time after Phil's presentation for a Q&A segment. You can submit your questions at any time through the chat function here on Zoom. And anyone who poses a question during the live portion of our webinar today will receive an autographed copy of Phil's intriguing book that happens to be of the same name as our webinar. So enough from me, let's get right to Phil Simon for today's session. Phil, it's all you.
Nick, thanks for having me. As he said, my name is Phil Simon. Thank you for your time. I've got 94 slides in 50 minutes, so let's rock and roll. Here's my plan of attack for today. After a quick introduction, I'll jump right into COVID-19 and work. Where are we now? I'll talk about how technology has changed. Specifically, we've seen an explosion in internal collaboration hubs. If you don't know what one is, don't worry, I'll make that painfully clear shortly. I'll then move on to the centerpiece of my new book, Reimagining Collaboration. That is the Hubspoke model of collaboration. My goal during this webinar is to get you to think about how you work with others differently, regardless of whether that's in person, hybrid, or remote. I'll then put on my Swami hat. I'll make some predictions for the future as it pertains to work. I'll offer you some tips about how to navigate this future, and we should have time for about 10 minutes of Q&A. Quote of the day, one of my faves, Churchill said, "Never waste a good crisis." I don't think that there's any doubt that we are still in the midst of one, but within crisis, there is significant opportunity. So let's bust right into COVID-19 and work. Where are we now? Well, many employees, if not most in the United States, continue to punch in virtually. 56% of US workers are working remotely all of the time or part of the time. Now, compared to months past, more workers want to return to the office for all sorts of reasons, but most employees aren't ready to do that completely at this time, whether it's fears of vaccination or they've gotten used to working from home or a couple of other issues that I'll mention shortly. Interestingly enough, 23%, nearly a quarter of all American workers surveyed would stay remote fully if given the option by their employers, which begs the question, will they be given the option by their employers? In other words, is remote work here to stay? And employees hope so. Roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of workers, depending on the poll, said that they would leave their jobs if their employers didn't offer at least the option of part-time remote work. As you could probably tell, I am very much a data guy. Some of my previous books have been about analytics, data visualization, big data. So in God we trust, as Deming said, all others must bring data. Here's a good number, 77%. Over 3/4 of American employees say that the option of working from home indefinitely would make them happier. This comes from an October 2020 survey from Owl Labs on the state of remote work. 54%, another interesting number. A percentage of employees who'd be willing to quit their jobs for one that allows them to work remotely. Right, I read a statistic the other day on LinkedIn. Their economic research department said that compared to a year ago, the percentage of jobs with the words remote work in the title had increased by, ready for this, something like 547%. So these days, workers have no shortage of options if they would like to work from home, because we're still in the middle of the greatest work from home experiment in the history of the world. Put differently, people want work to revolve around their lives, not the other way around, right? In the past, we've had to accommodate all sorts of personal obligations, right? Taking care of a family member, picking our kid up from soccer practice, even going to the gym, around our work, not the other way around. Well, now that we've had over a year of this new environment, we're not ready to give that up. 80% This is the percentage of employees, again, same survey, who expect to work from home at least 3 times per week after companies lift COVID guidelines. So again, workers are very much expressing a strong preference to continue working in, at the very least, a hybrid capacity, if not a fully remote capacity. Right? Now, here's one other major factor. Many people could not return to the office even if they wanted. In other words, they have permanently relocated. A recent Wall Street Journal piece showed that more than 7 million Americans have moved to a different county than they had started living in during the pandemic. If you want to access that article, it is behind a paywall, but this is a really fascinating data visualization that I was geeking out on a little bit earlier this week. So you can see a bunch of people are moving to Florida. A lot of people are moving out of California. And this begs the question, where did they go specifically? Well, researching my book, and so this data is a little bit dated, I found that quite a few people moved from large cities, specifically New York, San Francisco, Seattle, Boston, and Portland. This is in the 6 months, basically when the pandemic started, compared to the same time period in 2019. So if you can work remotely, then why am I commuting an hour and a half from New Jersey to New York, as I did many times when I lived in New Jersey, right? Why am I spending so much time battling traffic or sitting in a train if it's just to show up at an office so my manager can watch me code or watch me work? This begs the question, where did people go? Again, same research from LinkedIn, but people tended to go to smaller cities. I've read recently or seen some news reports about how people are jumping into places like Montana and Idaho, and that's actually resulted in a lot of issues when it comes to traffic. Some of these cities weren't built for massive influx of people. And in some cases, it's very difficult to buy a home in these places. Real estate is out of control right now because people can work pretty much anywhere if their companies will let them. What does this mean for productivity? And if you haven't figured it out by now, I'm a big fan of pop culture references. I've peppered my webinar with a bunch of them. Specifically, have employees been productive while working at home? It's a fair question. And by all accounts, people think not only are they as productive, in fact, they're more productive. 78% or more than 3 or 4 employees report greater productivity at home. And this isn't just one study from Gallup. Here's a report from Bloomberg, basically saying the same thing. Maybe because we're not commuting or because we're always at work, even though we may not always be working, we are arguably putting in an extra 50 minutes per day. And there's certainly a lot more meetings to go along with that. Now, to be fair, you could argue that workers come out ahead. I would much rather work for 48 minutes extra per day than battle traffic for an hour going downtown Phoenix, which is close to where I live right now. So without question, employees have been, if not as productive, then more productive, right? Which again begs the question, how and why is this possible? Well, again, you can make the argument that we are not commuting, so that gives us more time to step out and pick up our kid from soccer practice. There's also been this rise in the secondary workday, this period after you put your kids to sleep or you have dinner, you just get in a couple of hours of work between the hours of 8 and 11, maybe instead of Netflix. But I would argue that we have access to much greater tools, but again, don't believe me. eBay is a very successful, very long-standing technology company. I should know because in 2014, on one of my book tours, I spoke at eBay headquarters. There were some very smart people there. And in 2018, again, before the pandemic, they ran an internal poll and asked people 2 questions. Are you committed to collaboration, and do our existing tools meet your needs? Well, no surprise here, we're committed to collaboration. Who's going to disagree with that statement, right? It's kind of like saying on an interview, no, I'm not flexible, next question, right? But there was this massive chasm. The tools did not meet their employees' needs. Roughly half as many employees said that despite the fact the organization was quote unquote committed to collaboration, they did not give them the tools to effectively collaborate with others. So the bad news is a few years ago, even tech companies weren't terribly up to date on some of the collaboration tools. But again, Churchill said, never waste a good crisis. To be fair, hundreds of millions of people have started using new collaboration tools. As someone who spent a very long time, more than I care to admit, around the tech industry, there's nothing like the power of forced adoption. But when I talk about new collaboration tools, what specifically do I mean? I'm talking about things like Zoom, which we're using now for this webinar, but it's actually much more powerful than a webinar tool. One of my previous books was Zoom for Dummies. I could talk all day about that, but I won't. Microsoft Teams, which is what I used with Payix coordinating this webinar. We did not send email, and let's just say I'm very happy about that. Also Slack. Slack is a very powerful collaboration tool. One of my previous books was Slack for Dummies. There's also Google Workspace. Google, to be fair, has done a terrible job branding itself. This used to be called Google Docs or Google Drive or Google Sheets. Now they've kind of put it all together under Google Workspace, and you still have stalwarts like Cisco WebEx. So hundreds of millions of people adopted these tools in a very short period of time, which, to be fair, reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from Vladimir Lenin: there are decades where nothing happens, there are weeks in which decades happen. The pandemic accelerated a lot of different trends. I'm talking about, say, e-commerce going up from 18% to 28% in March of 2020 as a percent of GDP. I'm talking about the rapid adoption of online or hybrid education. So these were trends that were already taking place, but the pandemic served as an accelerant. Right? Specifically, which tools saw the most explosive growth? Well, we can start with Microsoft Teams, although it's kind of arbitrary. Teams is now at roughly 145 million daily users. Microsoft has done a very good job of marketing Teams. And to be fair, Teams is just part of Office 365. So if you're using PowerPoint or Excel, and lots of people are, Microsoft bundles Teams there. You don't have to pay for Teams as a standalone product. In fact, I don't even know if that's possible. So to this extent, Microsoft Teams was part of a unified suite of tools, or what some people would call a software stack. Unlike, say, Slack. Slack was a standalone tool and technically still is, but Salesforce agrees to buy it up for $28 billion. Why? Because Slack had grown to around 15 million daily active users, and Slack was so much more, as I'll talk about later, than just a way of exchanging messages. It was a very powerful tool that can serve as digital headquarters. But arguably, the poster child for rapid expansion of a tool or rapid growth in a tool is Zoom. Zoom came from out of nowhere. In December of 2019, roughly 10 million people used Zoom. And Zoom, again, I could talk about all day, but was primarily a B2B tool or business-to-business tool. In other words, the folks at Zoom built it specifically for enterprise use. Well, what happened? Lockdown. So people started using it not so much as a B2B tool or more of a B2C or business-to-consumer tool. So we saw institutions of higher education. We saw Pilates studios. We saw grade schools using it. And as a result, Zoom zoomed in growth, pun intended, from 10 million to 200 million in March of 2020 to 300 million in April of 2020. So needless to say, if you were prescient enough to have purchased Zoom stock before the pandemic, let's just say drinks are on you, even though it's come back down to earth a little bit. So I've mentioned a bunch of these tools, and I'm going to have Nick now run a couple of Zoom polls because I'm curious from the audience, which tools are you using? So go ahead and vote, and we should see the results in real time. Or not. Microsoft Teams. Okay, so that looks like it's the winner there. Slack, good. I'm going to hit close and we can go to the next one, Nick. I'm going to go with meh as a choice, but we'll see. Yeah, I was right, meh. Okay, so nobody's weak, but there clearly is some room for improvement. Thanks a lot, Nick. I'm going to go back to my presentation. Okay, so the return to work we're treating as a binary. We'll do it or we won't, or be it hybrid or not. But if you think about it, the return to work does not break down evenly. In fact, certain industries are better suited to return to work than others. Right, and I'll break those down shortly. This brings up a great quote from William Gibson, the sci-fi writer who, fun fact, created the cyberpunk genre. The future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. McKinsey Global did some research and they wanted to determine which fields or which disciplines were more adept at returning to work in this new environment. And no surprise, white collar or knowledge work tended to do a lot better than some of the blue collar jobs. If you're doing teaching, people don't necessarily want to pay for Zoom University in higher education. Real estate, yeah, you can do virtual tours, but many times people do actually want to, see the place before they actually bought it. Again, with utilities, I'm not going to operate some robot or some drone to come to your house and fix your electricity. But other types of industries were very well suited for this type of work. So against this backdrop, how are companies planning for the future? And at a high level, there are 3 different buckets. In the future, we're going to see companies that are always going to require workers to be on site. They can always be remote, and then there'll be hybrid approaches. Let's break this down. Bucket number 1, we are going back to the pre-COVID world. That means, you guessed it, Monday through Friday, long commutes, 9 to 5. I'm talking about typically conservative firms, maybe law firms, Goldman Sachs, financial institutions, JP Morgan, Amazon has famously said, we want our employees back in the office. And to be fair, there may be a little bit of paternalism there, right? We want to make sure that you're actually working. But in some cases, there are legitimate business benefits from what I'll call collisions. Researching my book on analytics, I was looking at Google, and Google famously gives away free food. Well, yeah, it's a bit benevolent on their part, but it also keeps you at work longer, right? You don't have to go home or go out of the office for lunch and pick up something. But there's also a benefit. Google studied the amount of time that people would spend waiting for lunch, and they try to monitor that. So if there was no line, right, you wouldn't bump into someone in a different department and you start talking, and all of a sudden, boom, there's your next idea for a great business. So 30 seconds, too short. 15 minutes, too long. Why? Because if you see that there's a line around the corner for Chinese food, you'll probably come back later or maybe get something at your desk. Okay. So there is a benefit to in-person work, certainly for certain types of work. It is possible through Zoom, but maybe not ideal. Next bucket, number 2, employees can work wherever they want. There are a lot of tech companies in this bucket here, talking about Twitter, Shopify, Dropbox. Interestingly, the Lincoln Financial Group and these management at these companies has come flat out and said, we don't really care where you work as long as you get your work done. It's not uncommon in these type of environments in which companies adopt core work hours. So to the extent that people could be in Timbuktu or in Mexico or in Nebraska, they want people to be available certain hours of the day because certain work needs to be done synchronously, right? You don't want to spend 2 weeks trying to set up a meeting with someone because 5 o'clock your time is 5 a.m. their time. Finally, there are companies that are trying to navigate a hybrid approach. Now, to be fair, this is tricky, but there are massive benefits to doing this. It's tricky because if you think about it, if you're all remote or all hybrid, everyone's on the same playing field, right? But if you're Citibank, if you're Salesforce, right, in which case some employees will be there some of the time, how do you navigate this environment? How do you make sure that you have enough space? How do you make sure that employees who are working remotely, right, get treated the same way as employees who aren't? Because it's very obvious to adopt that out of sight, out of mind mindset here. And there are a lot of other companies that fall into this bucket. Ford, as I said, Citigroup, TIA, Target, these companies are trying to figure out return to work plans. And let's just say that it is more art than science. Now, if it's harder to do hybrid work, and it usually is, then why not force everyone back to the office? Well, again, in some cases, you can't because employees have moved, even though you can try to backfill those positions. But I'd argue that there are massive benefits to adopting remote or hybrid work. And at a high level, this is one of my favorite quotes of all time. This is Don Ohlmeyer, the former Monday Night Football producer, and he said, the answer to all your questions is money. I tell folks that if you haven't figured it out by 30, you will soon. Let's talk about employee salaries. Some companies are saying, yes, you can work wherever you want, but don't expect to make the same money if you move from San Francisco to Denver or Nebraska or Boise, Idaho. This is a tweet from Bloomberg Quick Take, and it demonstrates exactly this. Expect more companies to say, we are not going to pay you San Francisco wages if you live in a low-cost area. So the company might save some money, even if you factor in the occasional employee travel once a month, once a quarter to corporate offices. The next elephant in the room, you guessed it, real estate. Companies will not need the same footprint for a physical world. Pinterest last August dropped $90 million to get out of a San Francisco office lease. Why? Because they saw that in the early months of the pandemic, employees were very productive. So why not save some money on real estate? Now, again, it's going to be challenging, figure out who comes in the office, who's got a desk, all those things. But again, the benefits tend to be significant, or as I'm fond of saying, the juice is worth the squeeze. Again, going back to the Churchill quote from earlier, this is a massive crisis, but a massive opportunity for companies to, wait for it, reimagine collaboration, reimagine how they work. This is Brian Elliott. I'd consider him a friend of mine. I had him on my podcast a while ago, which you can check out on my website. I'll mention a bit later. But he thinks that this isn't just an opportunity to save money. It's an opportunity to build digital headquarters, to really think at a whole new level about how we work. And going back to productivity for a second, this is Sundar Pichai. He's the chief executive of Alphabet. If you don't know, Alphabet is the holding company or the parent company of Google. And in 2020 at a press conference, he was talking about how hybrid work was challenging, but there was this massive opportunity for productivity increases, not to mention if you're Google and you're headquartered in San Francisco, there are only so many San Francisco engineers. What if you can find them in other parts of the country or other parts of the world? So there are massive potential benefits for adopting hybrid work or remote work. And here are just a few of the other benefits. Companies can position themselves as employee friendly. In the past, you might have said, oh, we're absolutely employee friendly, but don't even think about leaving at 2 o'clock to pick up your kid from school. Well, if you adopt this mindset, you might say, look, as long as you are there for these core hours, and as long as you get your job done, we don't care when you work or where you work. That could potentially be a massive advantage for companies trying to attract, retain, and motivate talented employees, which again is another one of the benefits here. So there are some significant benefits of embracing remote work. But regardless of what model your company adopts, I will say this without accurate fear of contradiction, right? Technology will play a major role in the future of work. I am as certain of that as I am sitting here right now. I'd also argue that we are just scratching the surface of what these collaboration tools can do. Many times we are treating these hubs as Outlook 2.0 or Skype 2.0, when in fact, Teams, Slack, Zoom, the tools that I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar are actually more powerful than that. It's not even close. If you think about Microsoft Teams as Outlook 2.0, then it's very similar to thinking about your phone as an actual phone, or to quote one of my favorite comedians, Gary Gulman. I love this guy. It's like saying your Lexus convertible is a very ornate cup holder. It will do that, but it can do a few more things. So let's dive into these hubs, right? And as I finished up Zoom for Dummies and was thinking about my next book, I couldn't get this question out of my head, right? To the extent that very few people are taking advantage of the power of these tools, what if we use them in a deeper, in a more holistic way? What would that look like? And I wound up with this idea of an internal collaboration hub. By that, I mean general use software, right? So it doesn't do one specific thing, but it promotes effective communication and collaboration, right? Think about your hub as a way of holding all critical meetings, formal and informal conversations, synchronous and asynchronous communication, a place to store all of your decisions, all of your documents, a place that can actually retain all of your institutional knowledge, a piece of software that actually connects to a bunch of different other pieces of software that I call spokes. I'll get to those shortly. And you can connect hubs to spokes without any technical skill required. You don't have to code, you don't have to call the IT department. Oftentimes it's simple as installing an app on your smartphone, right? And there are lots of different examples of hubs. I've mentioned a few of them earlier: Slack, Microsoft Teams, Google Workspace, Zoom. There's Workplace by Facebook. So there are a bunch of them, and I want to spend some time now talking about this hub spoke model of collaboration, which is going to look a lot like the cover of my book. What's up with this? There we go. Okay. So at the center of it all, you have the hub. It's Slack, it's Teams, it's Zoom, it's whatever. But just because you use one of those tools doesn't mean that you don't use other pieces of software. In fact, I've talked to presidents of relatively small companies, 10, 15 people, who use 50 to 60 different applications, things like DocuSign, things like QuickBooks, right? Salesforce, Workday for ERP. So you have all these different spokes that you can connect to the hub, right? This is what I'm talking about with the hub spoke model of collaboration. Your communication, your collaboration takes place within the hub, but it's easy to connect the spokes, right? And you can connect them very easily, as I'll explain very shortly. You connect all of these different systems and you wind up with your spokes looking something like this, right? So again, just because you're using Microsoft Teams Doesn't mean that you don't use Zendesk for ticket management, that you don't use Google Docs for productivity, right? Or you use an e-signature tool like DocuSign or Trello, Asana for project management. So this is the hub-spoke model visualized with generic systems. And this is very much, again, with the thinking that's going on at these companies. This is a visual from Slack. Slack is a center, Slack is the hub, but then they've got Google Docs, Outlook, DocuSign, Zoom, which you could actually use as a hub or a spoke, but that's neither here nor there. Again, other types of systems that connect. And I want to impress upon you the fact that these are two-way streams, right? I can connect Salesforce to Slack, to Zoom, to Microsoft Teams, and I exchange information, but actually can go both ways. So I'll show you later how this can significantly reduce data entry and manual work in general. And if you think that this can automate a lot of existing business processes, trust your instincts. Again, instead of having all these standalone applications that exist in isolation and encourage employees to toggle back and forth and multitask and lose track of what they're doing, I'm talking about building a single hub, a single gestalt in which everything is connected. Okay, so some of you might say, sounds too good to be true, right? How do I connect hubs and spokes? Well, at a high level, there are three ways to do it. One of them is particularly easy, and I'm going to use Asana as an example here. Asana is a project management tool used by, oh gosh, it's something like 82,000 paid customers in 190 countries, right? So the fact that you are using a hub doesn't mean that you can replicate all the functionality of Asana within the hub. But here's how I would stitch the two together, right? On Asana, again, 82,000 paying customers, 190 countries, a very popular tool. If I'm using Microsoft Teams as my hub, as lots of people do, I can go to a web page and I can install Asana for Microsoft Teams. Well, what happens when you do that? Well, again, just like installing an app on your smartphone, boom, you've now got that app on your Android, on your iPhone, whatever. And this is a picture of Asana inside of Slack. So I can interact with it and it can interact with me. If someone updates a project, I might not have to go to a separate app or a separate web page, or God forbid, my email to get that notification. I'm getting that notification in Teams. And if I want to mark a project as complete or a task as complete, I may very well be able to do that in Microsoft Teams using the Asana app. Sounds pretty good, right? But wait, some of you were Slack users. Are you guys second-class citizens? You are not. Slack app directory, pretty much the same thing. You're just installing it on a different hub. And I'm just picking on Asana here. There are lots of project management tools like Trello, like Basecamp. And in many, if not most instances, the more popular the app, the more likely there is to be an existing native app that you can install with just a few clicks of your mouse. Now, that's not always the case. And I want to be clear about that. What if there are no native integrations for your company's essential systems and apps? In some cases, it might be kind of an obscure app. In some cases, it may be a homegrown app or one that's kind of a legacy application or system that's a bit long in the tooth. So what can you do in this case? Well, there are other ways to connect hubs to spokes. If any of you have heard of tools like Zapier, AirSlate, IFTT, Airtable, or Workato, think of these as no-code or low-code tools, ones that, again, if you can operate a mouse, you can connect. And just as an example, you are able to go to one of these sites like Zapier and say, I want to connect Basecamp, which is a project management tool, to Slack. Well, guess what? Basecamp's got a ton of users. Zoom's got 300 million users. At some point, someone has probably said, wouldn't it be cool to stitch these two together? And if you go to one of the pages, you can click on Zapier, say, I want to connect it, Basecamp to Zoom, click a few mouse clicks, and before you know it, you've got those two things talking to each other. So you don't necessarily have to get the IT department involved, but then of course there's the last option. If you do have a legacy system and it is impossible to connect it through Zapier or through Workato or IFTT, then you absolutely could call a developer or your IT department and use these vendors' software development kits, SDKs, webhooks, or application programming interfaces, APIs, and build these custom integrations. So odds are there is a very, very good, if not 100% chance, yeah, you'll be able to connect hubs to spokes, right? So if we stitch these things together into a single gestalt, we do a number of different things. right? But the general question is, why even do this, right? What are some of the benefits, right? Well, researching the book, I discovered, talking to companies that actually had embraced the Hubspoke model, that their collaboration tended to go better if they use these hubs throughout the organization, right? In other words, yeah, it's fine if one group or one department, right, or one division uses it, but they really saw organizational benefits explode when everyone in the organization used the Hubspoke model to its fullest. A great example here is OfferUp. Some of you may have used the OfferUp app. It's kind of like a mobile first or native Craigslist, and you can buy and sell used stuff. And I was talking to a friend of mine, Natalie Angelilio. She's a VP over there. If you're listening, hello, Natalie. And she mentioned how in the early days when the company adopted Slack, the adoption was uneven, right? They weren't getting all the network effects, all the benefits of using it. Once the chief executive of the company said, we're using this throughout, there will be no more internal email, and I want to connect as many hubs, spokes to the hub as possible, they said that it was night and day. And when the pandemic hit, they were much better prepared than most companies. So your collaboration, I would argue, is going to increase. Next up, as I mentioned earlier, you can reduce or eliminate manual work. I don't have to update something in Basecamp or Trello or Salesforce and send an email to everyone. In fact, these connections go both ways. So in many cases, I don't even need to do that, right? This also allows organizations to be more transparent. People think, what are you talking about? Organization is already transparent. Well, really? If you're sending out a bunch of emails and people are already overwhelmed with them, how do you ensure that people get that information? It turns out that there's this massive transparency gap. This is from Kelton Global. They did a study with Slack, and they asked employers or business owners, what percentage do you think that your organization is very transparent? Number came back at 55%. I'm actually surprised that it's that low. If you think that the number of employees who agreed with that assessment is lower, again, trust your judgment here. So these collaboration hubs, by posting things in channels, make it a lot easier for the organization to be transparent. When you join an organization, you're not going to get deluged with 62 emails on what you have to do, paperwork. You can peruse these channels at your own time and get a sense of the culture, get a sense of the history of your particular group or department. But there are lots of other benefits of adopting the Hubspoke model of collaboration. This is a biggie here. The company can build a comprehensive knowledge repository. What do I mean by that? Again, one single piece of software that contains all of the communication, all of the collaborations, right? All of the data and metadata is absolutely enormous, right? Think about new employees joining the organization, or even if somebody leaves, right? What happens now? Employee leaves the organization and all of that institutional knowledge dies in his or her inbox, right? It's very difficult to resurrect that. You have to get the IT department involved, and typically organizations don't even do that. Next up, it reduces the time that employees need to find key documents. And if you think that you only spend a few minutes a day, that may be true, but it may not be. This study from McKinsey Global is a little bit dated from 2012, but effectively they found that on average, a white collar employee spends about 1.8 hours per day searching for key documents. Let's say that that number is exaggerated by a factor of 2. That's 0.9 hours per day or 54 minutes. Would you like to have 4.5 hours of your week back? Absolutely. And by the way, is it fun looking for documents, even if it's 2 hours a week or 1 hour a week, right? By using the hub the way that it's supposed to be used, you don't have to look in Dropbox. You don't have to look in OneDrive or any number of other places, including email attachments, right? It's there, discoverable by people. And before you ask the question, are there mechanisms in place with these hubs to make sure that people only see what they're supposed to see? The short answer is yes. Adopting the Hubspoke model of collaboration, okay? I could tell you all day long that this is beneficial to do, but what are some more benefits? Because maybe it doesn't ring home to you yet. Right? Well, think about this. I don't have to multitask as much. Again, make no mistake, using Microsoft Teams to its fullest does not mean that you never have to use Microsoft Word or Excel. I'm not saying that. But to the extent that you get the notifications from those spokes in the hub, then I spend less time juggling back and forth between and among these applications. And if you think that you're effectively multitasking, you are not. Neuroscience will tell you that you are effectively multi-changing. And it takes us a long time to get back to where we were. Arguably, the biggest benefit from my perspective, and I'm going to geek out a little bit here, is that if you use the hub the way that you should, you're going to be able to recognize all sorts of benefits from artificial intelligence and machine learning. I am not an expert on these topics. I've taught some lectures on it when I was a college professor, and I've read a bunch of books. But I do know this: all of these models, right, neural nets, those types of things are predicated on data. And if an organization decides in 2027 that they want to embrace the Hubspoke model, their competition that embraced it in 2020-21 would have had a 6-year head start. In chapter 15 of my book, I liken the future of work to this movie, if you've ever seen it. This is her, starring Joaquin Phoenix. It's about a guy who falls in love with an operating system, because the operating system, aside from having a sexy voice with Scarlett Johansson, knows him intimately. It knows what he wants, what he needs, when he needs a pep talk, when he needs a virtual hug. And I envision a future of work in which the hub is going to be all-knowing. It knows that you don't want to be bothered at 7 o'clock in the morning, but if it's from your boss, and not just because the word urgent is there, it's going to ring your smartwatch, or it's going to ring your Amazon Echo. All these things are very much possible, and that's when I really start to get excited. Not that you'll necessarily be bothered by these alerts, but the alerts will be more timely. They'll be more relevant. The best way to think about it is this: Slack CEO Stuart Butterfield once envisioned a future of Slack as an always-on chief of staff that answered questions you didn't think to ask. Who wouldn't want that thing working for him or her? I certainly would. Now on to some predictions. I've broken them up into 2 different categories: hubs and spokes, and then general predictions about the future of work. Collaboration hubs will continue to supplant internal email for internal communication. Again, at the very least, people are using Teams, Slack, Google Workspace for email substitutes. And if you think about it, that makes the most sense. You know that it's from a colleague, but I'll come back to limitations of email a little bit later. I'll also argue that hubs will become more external. What do I mean by that? I spent a decent part of this webinar proselytizing the benefits of internal collaboration hubs, but as you know, you often work with customers, with partners, with vendors. And Slack used to call them shared channels. Now they call it Slack Connect. But imagine an organization that uses the Slack workspace, organization A, and then organization B, right? Well, they're collaborating on a project. Maybe it's 2 research universities. I know that some of you on the call are from Texas. So maybe it's Rice with UT Austin, and you're doing research on cancer. Well, you both use Slack. Can we create a secure private pipeline to exchange information between our 2 organizations? The answer is yes, and that's all done through AWS, Amazon Web Services, like, oh gosh, just about everything else these days. So hubs will continue to become more external. If Microsoft hasn't launched this, then I'll bet my life that they're currently working on it. It's tough to keep track of all these companies because they innovate so quickly. I'd also argue that companies that embrace hubs and spokes will outperform those that cling to antiquated methods. Don't get me wrong. If your organization is making BlackBerries and you use Slack or Zoom the way that you should, I don't exactly think that you'll have a rosy future because no one's buying BlackBerries anymore. However, if I know their information, 2 companies that make widgets, that make mousetraps, they are identical on every conceivable level, except one of them uses the hub-spoke model of collaboration. I will take that company any day of the week and twice on Sunday. Next up, hubs and spokes will become more powerful and tightly integrated in the years ahead. I'm amazed at what these things can do, but we ain't seen nothing yet. After the book came out in February of 2021, Microsoft announced Project Viva, which is nothing if not ambitious. Think about Microsoft Teams as the operating system. So not Windows, not Mac OS, not Android, not iOS, but everything takes place on Microsoft Teams. And Viva would wrap everything in the Microsoft universe as well as a non-Microsoft universe around it. So everything would flow through Teams. It is a very ambitious project. You can watch any number of videos, including the demo video from Satya Nadella, but they talk about it being a bit of buzzword here, an employee experience platform. I don't know what that means, but if you think about it, if Microsoft can tap into worker sentiment, if they can see that Elaine isn't posting to channels as often as she used to, and Kramer tends to shout people down, yes, I'm a big Seinfeld fan, then isn't that valuable information for HR folks? As a manager, wouldn't you want to know that one of your employees is on the verge of checking out? I sure would. And we talk a lot about analytics when it comes to these things, but it's tougher to measure the squishier things, to use a technical term. knowing the extent to which employees participate in conversation and even the types of language or words that they use could be very instructive in rooting out legitimate business issues. Next up, Zoom. Right. Zoom recently crossed the 1,000 app threshold. When I was putting the polishing touches on Zoom for Dummies in May of 2020, they were at 200 apps. So think about this. Zoom as a company embraces platform thinking. What do I mean by that? Well, arguably my most successful book to this point in my life is my 2011 one, The Age of the Platform, how Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google have redefined business. So 2007, the iPhone dropped. Steve Jobs arrogantly thought that they don't need apps because they'll build them all. And by 2008, even Jobs, who was pretty stubborn, changed his mind. He said, yes, we will open this up to developers because we can't possibly create every app possible, right? I mean, Jobs was a smart dude, but he did not think that Angry Birds would get downloaded something like 2 billion times. So Zoom has very much embraced this mindset. We're going to externalize innovation. We very much want third-party developers to take our core offering in new and interesting places. Slack does the same thing, so does Microsoft Teams. Right? So that's it on my predictions for hubs and spokes. Let me go now to some non-hub and spoke predictions. First of all, I am very bullish on co-working spaces. I think that WeWork was incredibly overvalued at $48 billion, but at 7 or 8, it's starting to make sense. In fact, some companies are moving away from the term office and embracing satellite collaboration centers. So specifically, I don't want to go from New Jersey to New York, an hour and a half commute each day. What if I can go to a New Jersey suburb, meet up with 15, 20 colleagues to get some work done? Some companies, again, are embracing this idea of a satellite office or a collaboration center. I'd also be shocked if Airbnb, which last time I checked was worth something like $100 billion, doesn't move away from, or I should say, augment its core offering with residential real estate and do something with commercial real estate. Okay. This is all great information. What can I do with it? Well, here are some tips if you're curious about how you can navigate this increasingly uncertain world of work. First, if you haven't done this, get rid of email internally for communication. Now, don't think twice about it. I joke that if I didn't write my 2015 book, Message Not Received, I would have needed to see a shrink, but I'll just give you the bullet points here. Apart from jargon, which is a whole separate rant from me, email was never designed for communication. It is a great asynchronous way of sending files to people, but if you're having any kind of back and forth, you probably want to do some of it synchronously. And again, a great deal of knowledge dies in an employee's inbox when he or she leaves the organization. Put differently, email does not capture essential organizational knowledge, much less make it transparent for others to see. And this is a critical one to me. Email only gives you one bite of the apple. Yes, if you catch your mistakes soon enough, you can try a recall in Outlook, although who knows if you're going to be successful, right? And Gmail has the same thing with basically Control-Z or Alt-Do or undo. But if you think about it, we've all sent emails in which we've forgotten to attach a document or we've made a typo. You really can't edit an email. Once it's out there, it's out there. But in Teams, in Zoom, in Slack, you can edit a message. So you can catch your typo, you can attach the message without annoying someone with another notification. Next up, email typically lacks critical context, right? Again, in an inbox, it could be a message from anyone to you about anything. In Microsoft Teams, when I was working with Payix, and my Payix team lit up with a notification, guess what? I knew that it was someone contacting me about the webinar, right? Or about my book or about a logistic concern. No one was messing around with me, just sending me some random file. Next up, for the most part, email notifications are binary. Yes, we can set up complicated rules and forward to our smartphones, but they do not hold a candle when it comes to the ability to customize notification inherent in Slack, Zoom, Microsoft Teams. There are so many ways to do it. You can only get the notifications that matter to you. Never mind 5, 6 years in the future when you're going to have artificial intelligence really figuring out what you need to know, and just as important, when you need to know it, right? And finally, there are a couple of ways to do it, but email just doesn't really connect with spokes very well. Yes, as I show in the book, there is a way through Microsoft, I think it's called Power Automate, to turn an email into a message in a Teams channel, but that's really kind of a Band-Aid. Microsoft is betting that people will use Teams and is putting its development resources there, not making email that much better, because after roughly 40 years of email, I don't think it's going to get much better. Next up, stay in your lane. I have heard of organizations that try to combine Teams, Zoom, Slack, and other internal collaboration hubs. Technically, there are ways to do it, but I would argue you should just pick one and run with it. If Microsoft Teams is your choice, then I would encourage everyone to use Teams, a ditto for Slack or Zoom. I would also use hubs as part of your hiring process. If you ask employees or potential employees, applicants, are you collaborative? Again, who's going to say no? But by setting them up as guests, you can let them experience what it's like to collaborate inside your organization. If they say flat out, I don't use Teams, you want to hire that person, go with God. But now you have a valuable data point on whether that person is as flexible as he or she claims to be. And again, I'd also recognize and emphasize the importance of using these hubs throughout your organization. Do not let people off the hook. Oh, that's Cosmo, or that's George. He's a senior exec. He doesn't do Teams. Well, think about the message that you're sending to everyone underneath that person. Oh, it's okay. Use whatever tool you want. Well, how come he's so special? Why don't I get to pick my tool? So again, these hubs benefit from network effects. They become more valuable as more people use them. If you let someone off the hook, you're really setting a dangerous precedent. Also know going in that the bigger the organization, the tougher it is to collaborate, right? Again, with no other information, right? A 10-person organization is probably going to be easier to collaborate with than a 10,000-person organization. Also, take a look at your existing business processes and see if you can at least partially automate them. If you use DocuSign to sign documents, that's great. There's a DocuSign app for Slack that, trust me, will minimize the number of emails that you get. And there are all sorts of other ways that I describe in the book on how you can take a legacy business process and automate the hell out of it. And if uncooperative employees don't come around, what do? Well, in some cases, you might want to show them the door. I remember when I lived in Las Vegas, and the story will not stay in Las Vegas. I was talking to a startup founder around 2014, and they used, it might have been Jive software, but it's a tool that isn't quite as popular anymore. And the founder of the company was telling me about how they had a new hire who just would keep using email. And it was really a problem because whatever momentum, whatever flow the organization had stopped because they had to get out of that tool and address her concerns in email. And after several conversations, they said, look, you either do this or you're not going to work here anymore. And within 2 weeks, she wasn't working there anymore. So it is very important to get as many people on board as possible, particularly at a senior level. Start connecting new spokes to your hub. Again, you may not be able to do them all at once, but once you start to see the benefits of the hub spoke model in action, you might take a look at a legacy process or one that gives you emails every 15 minutes and say, is there a better way to do this? I bet you the answer is yes. That's my story, and I'm sticking with it. If you want to find out about me, here's my information. I want to thank you for your time. And Nick, I will open it up for Q&A. What I say, 45 minutes? Damn it, I showed up at 47. Let's rock.
Well, you had such intriguing information to share. So many great studies and data points. You've so eloquently articulated. Fascinating topic, to say the least. I know I was definitely jotting down notes myself to share with my colleagues to make our use of collaboration tools more efficient and effective. So thank you again for the intriguing presentation. And if you do have a question for Phil Simon here during the live portion of our webinar, just use the chat function here on Zoom, and that will qualify you to get a free autographed copy of Phil's book that he referenced throughout the presentation. Again, Reimagining Collaboration, Slack, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, and the Post-COVID World of Work. Our webinar today brought to you by Payix, together with Visa. And Phil, certainly you covered a lot of points that are germane to any type of business, whether it's automotive or education or what have you. But just a question to get us started here. How would you say a collaboration tool or hub perhaps might decrease the potential for someone to use, we'll call it good emotional intelligence, EQ, instead of IQ, meaning that it's easy to fire off a message via Slack or Teams that they might say the wrong thing, or something perhaps in the heat of the moment, so to speak, might get said. How would you approach that element of the tools functionality?
It's a great question, Nick. And look, people have sent many, many stupid emails over the years, right? It's arguably easier because you're in Slack, you're so used to sending messages or Teams or Zoom. I agree with you. You want to be able to read the room. Marshall McLuhan famously said, I think it was 40 years ago, don't quote me on that, that the medium is the message. The fact that someone spends the time to compose an email and write it to you and CC your boss, you could argue that that is more important than the actual content of the message. Now, to be fair, Slack is, Zoom is, Teams is partially less formal because I can send an animated GIF, which I like to do. And I say GIF, not GIF, but that's a whole religious argument with people I won't get into. Or I could put emoji thumbs up or emoji with the eyes looking to the left as in looking too into it. I can't imagine sending an email, right, with an emoji, right? That just doesn't make any sense. So I've come full circle on those types of tools. But if it's a public channel in Teams that everyone in the company can access, and let's say it's a 1,000-person company, the industry doesn't matter. Do you want your first post there to be a risque animated GIF or GIF? I would say no, right? Now, if you've got a less formal one that you're joking around with your friends and you know each other, right? And you want to push the envelope a little bit, it's a private channel. Again, nothing racist or sexist or anything like that. So yeah, these tools don't prevent you from doing something stupid. And you wouldn't get any disagreement from me. A little bit of EQ or IQ is not a bad thing.
Indeed. Again, our special guest expert for today's webinar is award-winning author, speaker, trainer, professor, and advisor Phil Simon for our session brought to you by Payix together with Visa, Reimagining Collaboration, Slack, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, and the post-COVID world of work. And Phil, you mentioned artificial intelligence, machine learning during your presentation. Certainly two terms and concepts that are often referenced in fintech and so many elements of our lives. And not to be too flippant about it, but does the hub and spoke approach lead to an end of humanity, so to speak, meaning that the data collection and retention, how might it again hasten job and employee relations? Again, how do you see that proceeding when in something that's certainly complex already?
Yeah, I mean, look, if your job means that you are manually updating someone about something, I would argue that you're an endpoint. I do a podcast and I had on Kevin Bruce, who's a best-selling author, writes for the New York Times. His new book is called Future Proof. And there are 9 rules for how you navigate a future rife with with artificial intelligence and machine learning. And my favorite rule of his is don't be an endpoint. In other words, you could be an Uber driver. If your goal is to take someone from point A to point B, then there are plenty of self-driving car companies out there that are trying to automate that. Right? So you could argue that if your job involves being an endpoint, then it's probably going to be automated. And really, is that a quote unquote good job? I'm not going to have that philosophical debate with folks, but shouldn't our time at work be spent doing something meaningful as opposed to something rife for automation? So yes, AI will automate certain jobs, but the famous Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter, I think over 100 years ago, coined the term creative destruction, right? The advent of the web meant that there was a need for web designers, but not so much for travel agents because people could use Expedia or Travelocity to book their own travel. The smartphone meant that we no longer needed a dedicated compass or a dedicated GPS device because that was just an app on our phone. So you're right, this will hasten the dissolution of certain types of jobs or even certain categories of jobs, but what will come from that? And I'm not smart enough to know all the answers there.
Well, referencing another intriguing point of your presentation, the work from home concept, as you can see from my background here, I'm blessed to be part of those millions of workers who have made the permanent shift to a work from home scenario by and large. But how do you see again firms large and small approaching this concept? Work from anywhere, as you referenced. It doesn't have to necessarily be San Francisco. It could be Butte, Montana, or Louisiana, or wherever. But how do you see that perhaps employees and employers perhaps losing sight of a work-life balance if the office is 3 steps away from the kitchen, like it is for me, that you keep things in perspective still?
It's a really interesting point. And again, I'm not smart enough to have all the answers, but you could argue that if you're always at work, even if you're not always working, then you lose that separation, right? If you go to a play, right, or an opera, hopefully you're turning off your smartphone because you realize that you're experiencing something in person that you couldn't quite experience remotely or virtually. So the onus is on us, but I'd argue that when we demonize technology, we say, oh, Slack's got a notification feature that I don't like. My manager keeps bugging me. Well, is that a technology issue, or is that a management or culture issue? Because look, forget that technology even exists and I go into an office, right? And I just go up to your desk every 4 minutes, Nick, and say, I need you, I need you, I need you, right? That is me being, right, a nudge without having anything to do with technology. So I guess that I'm particularly proud of the fact that this is a holistic book. I don't have all the answers. I ask a lot of questions, but the impact of culture, right, we can't underestimate. You show me a dysfunctional culture, they'll use Slack or Zoom or Teams in a very pernicious way. I remember when I was writing Zoom for Dummies, story broke that a company away that does custom luggage, right? Direct to consumer, DTC, and they were using Slack as a cudgel, right? So no private channels and everything had to be public. And if you don't respond to every Slack message within an hour, you're on the you-know-what list. Don't blame Slack for that, because you could do that with email, you can do that with a fax, you can do that with a smartphone. I think it was Drucker who famously said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So let's not minimize the importance of that. He was a pretty smart guy.
Indeed. Well, again, referencing back to your great presentation, Phil, you had a lot of data and insights and studies in relation to the appeal of working from home, as well as the interest in coming back to the office, either through any concrete data, so to speak, or maybe just some anecdotes that you've heard from or read from industry contacts, colleagues, what have you. How do you see are younger workers looking to get back to the office, for example, or more seasoned graybeards like yours truly embracing the work from home model and would rather keep it? From an age demographic perspective, how do you see that trending, either from data that you've seen or maybe just some anecdotes that you've read or heard from your list of contacts?
Yeah, this is a fascinating subject, Nick, and I've very much been paying attention to the recent studies. Ironically, when people like to dunk on millennials or Gen Y or iGen or whatever we're calling them these days, maybe not so much, right? For one, many of them can't afford to buy a home, and a red hot real estate market doesn't make that easy. So they're living with their parents and they don't necessarily want to be there all the time. Apart from that, many of the younger folks want to get to the office because they haven't built up that social capital, that social currency. No one in the organization really knows who they are, particularly if you got your job during the pandemic. And even though there are apps like Donut that make it easy to have these types of collisions inside of one of the hubs, and they're pretty cool, it's really not the same, right? Even now when I do webinars or take calls with clients and I've got a Rush poster and a Usual Suspects poster and the shot of my book in the background, that's a window in my personality, kind of like if you were to go into my desk in the physical world and go, oh, you like Rush? I love Rush. They're my favorite band, which of course it has to be. So there are ways that you can get to know people in person that you couldn't necessarily do in a virtual environment. And for all sorts of reasons, younger folks, I think, do want to get to the office to make a name for themselves. A lot of the people, ironically, who agree with them are some of the older folks. I know Jamie Dimon, JP Morgan Chase, I think he's 63 or 64, I'd have to check. He says, no, we want everyone back, as this has never happened. So people are all over the place here, and it is going to be a personal decision. And I already know of some people who said, yeah, my company wants me back, I'm currently looking. So one size is not going to fit all, but I'll go back to a point that I made a few minutes ago. Regardless of the model, right, we're going to need some digital headquarters, and hubs and spokes, I think, are going to be a big part of the future, irrespective of the particular model that a company adopts.
Intriguing indeed. Again, our special guest for this webinar, brought to you by Payix together with Visa, is award-winning author, speaker, trainer, and professor and advisor Phil Simon, for our session titled Reimagining Collaboration, Slack, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, and the Post-COVID World of Work. And if you want more details and insights from Phil, simply just go to his website at philsimon.com. And to round us out for our session, Phil, you've described again how many facets of work can be completed via the spoke and hub model, but not to get too much in the weeds and perhaps legal ramifications or what have you. But for, Slack, certainly, for example, certainly can be a formal or informal way of communicating. Again, a balanced question. How have you seen firms of all sizes have some lightheartedness, perhaps using these communication tools, and then at the same time still having some firm, whether it's a project deadline or company protocols or what have you, that's a more formal variety in place as well. Maybe just to round us out, and anything else you'd like to add as well, as far as the capabilities of these tools to have some informal communication as well as some contractual or formal dialogue as well.
Yeah. A big part of it, Nick, involves using multiple channels. One of the biggest annoyances for me is sending me an email that doesn't pertain to me. Right. So when I worked as a college professor, I advocated for using Slack. We had an enterprise Slack license. There was no marginal cost for using it in the department. So we don't do that. So routinely, I wasn't tenure track or tenured. I don't have a PhD. I've just got a master's and blah, blah, blah. So any kind of PhD or tenure type thing just didn't interest me. So I'd get these emails and I'd spend even 5-10 seconds on it to go, this doesn't apply to me. Why am I spending any emotional energy or mental energy on it? It just doesn't make any sense. So by splitting things into different channels, it would be very easy for me to unsubscribe to things about which I had no interest, right? And the same thing applies to your point about humor. Look, if you're busting ass on a deadline and it's 11:59 at night and someone makes a joke, hey, read the room, right? But if it's a serious channel about company announcements and you're the guy who's always chiming in with Seinfeld emojis or animated GIFs, then that's probably not the right place for it. Ditto if, say, you're looking for movie recommendations or looking for people to go to lunch with, right? Yes, you could post that in the marketing channel if you work in marketing, but is that really the right place? So I would typically get the question when I do training or consulting, how many channels do we need? I'd say really as many as you want. If you're just starting out of the gate with one of these hubs and you only used it for exchanging messages, then you may want to start slow. And if you've got 5 or 6 for a 20-person company, that's probably not enough. But if you've got 20,000 for a 10-person company, whoa, that's way too many. So use your judgment. It's very easy to create new channels. It's very easy to archive channels that no longer make sense or delete them altogether. But generally speaking, I would much rather have a record of who said what when, because God forbid there's some kind of lawsuit or some type of issue and go, oh yeah, Phil actually has a long history of being inappropriate and here are cases in point, as opposed to, well, he said this in the elevator and I didn't really know what he meant by that. So again, just use your head, right? There is no tool, as I said before, that makes it impossible for you to act like an idiot. And if you're new to an organization, you may want to exercise more discretion than if you and I have to work together for a couple of years, right? And we know each other, we've broken bread together. You might not know my sense of humor. That doesn't mean that I can't go over the line, but just exercise caution, particularly if you're new at a company or a department or a job.
That's award-winning author, speaker, trainer, professor, and advisor, Phil Simon, for our webinar today, brought to you by Payix together with Visa, Reimagining Collaboration, Slack, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, and the post-COVID world of work. Again, on the screen is Phil's pathways to reach him, his website, philsimon.com, or at Phil Simon on social media. Phil, thank you so much for sharing such intriguing information as we really are in a time of change, and no way we want to waste any type of crisis or challenge. Thank you so much for the intriguing information and great recommendations.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
And on behalf of all of us at Cherokee Media Group, we thank you for joining us, and we look forward to having you again next time.